The sky above New Perth turned dark as the alien ships arrived in formation and blocked out both suns that normally lit the colony world with warm golden light each morning when the farmers woke to tend their fields and the children ran to school, through streets lined with earth flowers transplanted across the stars to make this new world feel like home. And the defense station orbiting high above watched with growing alarm as sensors detected energy signatures that no human had ever seen before, and Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge looking at displays that showed 12 human frigates and one aging cruiser preparing to fight against something that looked like it could swallow them whole without even slowing down. The Krell Armada moved with terrible purpose, and their ships were angular monsters of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their weapons charged with a sound that human sensors could barely register as they established orbital positions that gave them complete control of the space around New Perth. And Jake had served 15 years in the Colonial Defense Force and seen combat twice before, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the sheer, overwhelming power of what he now faced as the first exchange of fire lit up the void, and human shields flickered and failed under the sustained barrage of Krell energy weapons that cut through defensive barriers like they were nothing more than air captain. Lisa Garrett worked at her console sending emergency transmissions to Earth Command, while the station shuddered around her from repeated impacts and sparks rained down from damaged conduits overhead, and crew members shouted reports about failing systems and rising casualties, and she kept her voice steady because that was what captains did, even when they knew the battle was already lost, and the colony below was about to fall under alien control, and millions of people were going to face enslavement or worse because humanity had finally encountered something in the vast darkness between stars that saw them as prey rather than equals. The last frigate exploded in a brilliant flash that briefly lit the station bridge through the observation ports, and Jake watched it die knowing the crew had fought to the very end and bought maybe 30 more seconds for the evacuation shuttles to launch from the planet's surface, and he called for all personnel to abandon station and get to the escape pods, because there was nothing left to fight with and no reason to throw away more lives in a battle that could not be won. But he and Lisa stayed at their posts because someone had to buy time for the others to escape, and someone had to make sure the final message reached Earth Command with all the tactical data they had gathered about these Krell invaders. They redirected every remaining bit of power to the experimental railgun that had never been tested in actual combat, and Jake hoped it would at least scratch the enemy before the end came. And when they fired the tungsten round, it screamed through space at tremendous velocity and struck a Krell destroyer and punched completely through its hull, and the alien ship exploded in a chain reaction that took out two smaller vessels nearby, and for just a moment the Krell advance paused, as if they had not expected any resistance that could actually hurt them. And Jake and Lisa looked at each other and smiled, because they had proven that humans could fight back even if they could not win. Then the Krell flagship fired, and the station never had a chance as multiple beams converged on its position and tore through what remained of its shields and armor and structure, and turned it into expanding debris in less than 10 seconds, and Jake and Lisa died instantly, never knowing that their final message had gotten through to Earth, or that their sacrifice would be remembered as the moment humanity realized it could no longer afford to be peaceful explorers in a galaxy that contained species willing to conquer and enslave anyone weaker than themselves. On Earth, deep beneath Geneva, in command centers built to survive anything short of planetary destruction, Fleet Admiral Daniel Crawford received the transmission from New Perth and watched it 3 times, trying to understand how humanity had lost 9 colonies and 50 million citizens in just 3 weeks to an enemy that seemed unstoppable. And he stood before holographic displays showing red icons spreading like infection across the map of human space, while the Joint Chiefs and government representatives argued about whether to retreat and consolidate forces around core worlds, or try to hold every colony even though they lacked the ships and weapons to do so. General Maria Santos wanted to pull back and save what they could, while Ambassador Chen Liu asked how they could justify abandoning millions of people to slavery and death, and the debate went in circles until Crawford raised his hand for silence and said in a voice that carried absolute authority that they would not retreat and they would not abandon anyone, because it was time to deploy the secret weapon that Earth had been building for 20 years in hidden shipyards, where even most government officials did not know what was being constructed in the name of Planetary Defense Project Vanguard, had consumed resources that could have built 100 conventional warships, but instead went into 3 vessels unlike anything humanity had ever created before. And General Victor Kane asked if Crawford was certain, because the Dreadnoughts had only completed basic trials and never faced combat, and Crawford replied that combat would be their final test, and if they failed, then humanity would watch everything burn. But if they succeeded, then the Krell would learn that attacking Earth had been the worst mistake any species could make. The holographic display showed 3 massive ship designs rotating slowly above the conference table, and each dreadnought measured over 2 kilometers in length and bristled with weapons that made conventional warships look like toys in comparison, and they were not built for exploration or peaceful contact, but for a single purpose, which was to dominate any battlefield with overwhelming force and prove that humanity could build weapons to match any threat the galaxy might present. Crawford explained that each dreadnought carried plasma cannons capable of burning through any known shielding and railgun batteries that could engage targets at ranges where enemy weapons could not reach, and point defense systems that could track thousands of incoming missiles, and their armor was composed of layered materials that could absorb energy weapons fire that would vaporize normal ships. But the real secret was something called the Graviton Lance, which used focused gravitational waves to tear enemy vessels apart at the molecular level, and simulations suggested it would be devastating, though it had never been tested against actual targets. The ships were named Titan and Goliath and Leviathan after legendary beings of terrible power, and they had been constructed in secret at Lagrange Station, which had been under communications blackout for 2 decades, while components built in different facilities across 3 star systems were assembled into weapons that would change the balance of power in this region of space. And the crews were already aboard, with captains chosen for their tactical brilliance and unwavering determination to protect humanity at any cost. Captain Rachel Morrison commanded the Titan, and she was the daughter of Jake Morrison, who had died defending New Perth, and she had volunteered knowing she might not return, but also knowing that if she did not fight, then her father had died for nothing. And Captain Kevin Harper led the Goliath, while Captain Nicole Brennan commanded the Leviathan, and all 3 understood that they carried humanity's hope and fury in equal measure as they prepared to launch and show the Krell what happened when you threatened Earth at Lagrange Station. Massive docking clamps released, and the 3 dreadnoughts powered up their fusion drives, which glowed like newborn stars, and they were magnificent and terrifying as they accelerated away from Earth, carrying weapons that humanity hoped would be enough, and tactics that had been refined through countless simulations, and crews that were ready to prove that humans would not go quietly into slavery or extinction. Rachel sat in the command chair of the Titan and thought about her father and all the people who had died in the Krell invasion, and she gave the order to engage maximum speed toward New Perth, where the enemy still held control and thought themselves safe, and she knew that in 18 hours they would arrive, and the Krell would learn that humanity was done being prey and ready to become something the galaxy had not seen before, which was a species that combined mercy with overwhelming force and offered peace, but promised total war to any who refused. The 3 dreadnoughts vanished into faster than light travel, leaving Earth behind and carrying with them the determination of billions who refused to surrender, and the memory of millions who had already fallen, and the promise that those deaths would not be meaningless, because humanity was about to show the Krell Empire and every other species watching that attacking Earth was not a conquest, but a mistake that would cost them everything they thought they had won. The Krell occupation fleet held position above New Perth in perfect formation, and below on the scarred planet's surface, humans worked in forced labor camps, extracting resources for an empire that cared nothing about their dignity or culture or dreams of freedom. And War Master Zekthor stood on the bridge of his flagship Crimson Talon, surveying what he considered a successful conquest, because his species had been doing this for 2 centuries, across 73 star systems, and humans seemed no more difficult than any other prey species they had encountered. His second commander reported that resource surveys were complete, and the planet contained valuable heavy metals and rare elements that could be extracted using the human population as labor, and Zekthor clicked his mandibles in satisfaction, because the Empire demanded increased production, and these conquered humans would serve whether they wanted to or not, because that was the way of the galaxy. And the strong took what they needed from the weak 28 warships made up the occupation force, and Zekthor considered it more than sufficient to maintain control, because human resistance had been minimal after their defense fleet was destroyed, and he admitted privately that they showed some courage, but courage without power meant nothing, and he had conquered too many worlds to fear a species that could barely defend a single colony against Krell military might. Then the censor officer announced, with alarm in his voice, that 3 unknown contacts were entering the system with mass signatures, unlike anything in the Krell database, and they were approaching at high velocity directly toward the occupation fleet, and Zekthor moved to the sensor station with interest because he had never encountered anything the database did not recognize, and the specifications suggested ships over 2 kilometers in length, which exceeded anything humans had shown before. He ordered battle stations immediately because warrior instincts warned him that something was wrong, and the Krell fleet deployed in defensive formation with energy weapons powering up, and missile tubes loading, and shields reinforcing to maximum strength, and they were ready for combat and confident in their technological superiority. But they had no idea what was about to hit them with force that would shatter everything they thought they knew about human capabilities. Rachel Morrison studied the tactical display on the Titan Bridge and saw 28 enemy ships standing between her and the planet where her father had died, and she asked her weapons officer about their formation, and he explained they were bunched tight, probably expecting close range combat like previous human opponents, and Rachel smiled coldly because the Krell were about to learn that these were not previous human opponents, and humanity was done fighting on enemy terms. She transmitted to the other Dreadnoughts and ordered execution of Battle Plan Thunder, and her engineering officer suggested they demonstrate railgun capabilities first to show what human weapons could do before revealing the special systems, and Rachel agreed because she wanted the Krell to understand they were outmatched in every way and at every range and with every type of weapon humanity had developed. The 3 Earth Dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously from 800,000 kilometers away, and tungsten carbide rounds weighing several tons each accelerated to tremendous velocity and streaked across the void in a wall of kinetic death, and the Krell sensor officer barely had time to register incoming fire before the rounds struck and punched through energy shields as if they were not there, and through hulls and through the interior of ships and out the other side, leaving catastrophic damage in their wake. A heavy cruiser broke apart as its reactors went critical, and the explosion took out 2 nearby corvettes, and more rounds found targets as another cruiser took multiple hits and ruptured along its entire length, and a destroyer tried evasive maneuvers but moved too slowly, and 3 rounds reduced it to wreckage, and the corvettes fared even worse because their smaller frames could not withstand even glancing blows from projectiles moving at such incredible speeds. In 10 seconds, the Krell lost 8 ships, and Zekthor stared at his display in shock because 8 ships were gone from a single volley, at a range where Krell weapons could not even reach the enemy. And what kind of species had they provoked? And he roared orders to return fire and close the range because they needed to bring their own weapons to bear. But even as the fleet charged forward, the Dreadnoughts fired again and again and again. Rachel watched the enemy formation disintegrate and noted they were panicking because they had never faced an opponent who could engage at extreme range, and her weapons officer reported 13 ships destroyed and 4 heavily damaged, and the enemy was attempting to close. But the railguns were reloading faster than Krell tactical doctrine had anticipated, and by the time the survivors finally reached their own weapons range, they had lost 17 ships. The remaining Krell opened fire desperately, and their energy weapons lashed out across the void. But the Dreadnought shields absorbed the barrage with ease and barely registered the impacts, because human defensive systems had been designed for a different type of warfare, and Krell weapons were like throwing pebbles at a fortress wall, and the shields were actually recharging faster than the enemy could damage them. Rachel ordered activation of the plasma cannons, and they came online with charging coils building to full power. And when they fired, superheated plasma contained in magnetic bottles struck Krell cruisers with the force of small stars, and enemy shields lasted less than a second before collapsing, and the plasma ate through hulls like acid through paper, and found ammunition stores and reactor cores, and the ships exploded from internal detonations. Within minutes, only 5 Krell ships remained operational, including the flagship, and they were surrounded and outgunned and completely outclassed, and the battle was over except for the final surrender. And Zekthor stood amid smoke and sparks on his damaged bridge. with half his crew dead and his fleet destroyed. And the 3 human vessels advanced with weapons tracking his ship with cold precision. For the first time in his long military career, Zekthor felt something he had never experienced before, which was fear, and his second commander reported the humans were hailing them, and Zekthor straightened, drawing on centuries of warrior pride, and ordered the communication through. And the view screen showed a human female sitting in the command chair with an expression that was cold and hard. Rachel identified herself as captain of the Earth defense ship Titan, and told Zekthor he was surrounded and outgunned and needed to power down weapons and prepare to be boarded, and his surviving crew would be taken into custody, and the enslaved colonists would be freed, and he would stand trial for war crimes against humanity. And Zekthor asked how they could do this because the Krell Empire would not allow it, and they had conquered dozens of species. Rachel leaned forward with blazing eyes and said, the Empire would learn what others had not taught them, which was that humanity did not surrender and did not break and did not forget, and the Krell had come to human worlds and killed human people and enslaved human colonies, and now they would face consequences, and she gave Zekthor 30 seconds to comply, or she would destroy his ship, and anyone aboard who resisted. Zekthor looked around his ruined bridge at bodies of his crew and displays showing his shattered fleet, and he had fought in 100 battles and won them all. But this was different because these humans had destroyed his entire fleet with contemptuous ease, and their weapons were beyond anything he had encountered, and their ships seemed invincible, and he had no choice. So for the first time in Krell history, a War Master surrendered. Marine boarding parties secured the remaining Krell ships and liberated the colonists below, and Rachel stood on the Titan observation deck, looking out at stars and thinking about her father, who had died here defending this colony, and now she had reclaimed it in his name. And her engineering officer joined her and said this was just one fleet, and the Krell Empire had hundreds more. Rachel replied quietly that they would deal with them, one fleet at a time if necessary, because the Krell wanted to show humanity its place in the galaxy, and now humans would show the Krell theirs. And she ordered a message sent to Earth Command that New Perth was liberated, and they were moving to the next colony, because the Krell occupation ended today. Word of the battle spread through both human and alien communication networks, and the impossible had happened because a human fleet outnumbered and attacking an entrenched position achieved complete victory with 0 casualties, and the Krell, feared throughout the sector for their military might, had been crushed. And somewhere in the depths of space in the heart of the Krell Empire, the High Council received reports with disbelief and growing dread. The humans had revealed weapons that defied understanding, and ships that seemed invulnerable, and tactics that rendered Krell doctrine obsolete. And the Empire had made a grave mistake because they had awakened something they could not control and given Earth a reason to build weapons of war, and now those weapons were coming for them with determination that could not be stopped. The message was clear across the galaxy that humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, and the balance of power would never be the same, because when Earth dreadnoughts arrived, the enemy knew fear, and that fear would spread through every species with hostile intentions, until they understood that humanity was no low. News of New Perth liberation sent shockwaves through the Krell Empire because, for 2 centuries, they had been unstoppable, and now in a single battle, they lost an entire occupation fleet to a species they had dismissed as primitive and on the Krell homeworld. The High Council convened an emergency session in their obsidian chamber, designed to project power, but today they felt anything except powerful as they watched battle recordings for the 20th time supreme. Commander Vorkash studied how human ships moved with precision and coordinated fire with deadly efficiency, and their weapons outranged Krell armaments by huge margins, and their defenses seemed impenetrable, and he admitted they had underestimated humanity because the previous resistance had been restrained, while humans bought time to deploy these dreadnoughts. That changed everything about the tactical situation. Council member Theric slammed his fist and declared humans were still weak, and this was only 3 ships, and the Empire had fleets numbering in hundreds, and they should crush the humans with overwhelming numbers. But Science Director Melkara countered by asking how many ships they would lose in the process, because these humans had made technological advances nobody anticipated, and throwing more vessels at them might simply result in more losses. Vorkash said they needed time to analyze human capabilities and develop countermeasures, and meanwhile, they must strengthen remaining occupation forces and consolidate positions in colonies they still controlled. But even as the Council made plans, the humans were already moving with speed that caught everyone by surprise. In 3 weeks following New Perth, the Dreadnoughts moved systematically through occupied colonies, and each encounter followed similar patterns where Dreadnoughts arrived and destroyed Krell fleets with overwhelming firepower and secured liberation of human populations. And the Krell tried different tactics and formations and weapon configurations, but nothing worked against ships that seemed built to counter every strategy. Captain Kevin Harper, commanding the Goliath, liberated mining colony New Helena, where Krell tried using asteroid fields as cover, hoping to ambush the Dreadnought, but advanced sensors detected them long before visual contact, and Harper simply bombarded their positions from extreme range, and the Krell never got close enough to fire a single shot. Captain Nicole Brennan, commanding the Leviathan, faced more challenging situation at agricultural world New Eden, where the Krell commander took hostages and threatened execution if Leviathan attacked, and Brennan responded by using precision weapons to disable the flagship without destroying it, and deployed Marines who overwhelmed the crew and freed hostages, and not a single colonist was harmed. Rachel Morrison in the Titan became legendary among both human and alien populations because her tactical brilliance and unwavering determination were subjects of countless reports, and the Krell began calling her Death Bringer in their language, and she wore the title with pride, knowing it meant the enemy finally understood that humanity would not be conquered. After liberating 5 colonies in rapid succession, the 3 Dreadnoughts rendezvoused at Arcturus Station, where Fleet Admiral Crawford had traveled from Earth to oversee the campaign, and in the main conference room the captains met with Crawford and generals and high-ranking officers to discuss what came next. Crawford studied the strategic map with satisfaction, noting 5 colonies liberated in 3 weeks with minimal human casualties and Krell occupation collapsing faster than projections. But Rachel leaned forward and said with respect they were not collapsing fast enough because the Krell still held 4 more colonies, and intelligence suggested they were massing a major fleet to counterattack, and humanity needed to maintain initiative. Harper agreed that Krell were regrouping, and every day of waiting gave them time to develop countermeasures to human weapons, and General Kane spoke up saying intelligence indicated Krell were constructing new shield generators specifically designed to counter kinetic weapons and developing longer-range energy weapons, and human technological advantage would not last forever. Brennan crossed her arms and proposed they hit remaining Krell forces before new systems could be deployed, using all 3 Dreadnoughts in coordinated assault to overwhelm the enemy before they could adapt, and Crawford considered this, knowing it would leave Earth without Dreadnought protection. But Rachel interrupted, saying if Krell had reserve fleet, they would have deployed it by now, and the enemy was afraid and reacting rather than planning. General Santos nodded, saying Rachel had a point about psychological impact of human victories shaking Krell morale, and this was the time to press advantage. And Crawford took a deep breath, weighing risks against rewards, and finally agreed they would launch coordinated strike against remaining occupied colonies, but wanted operation plan down to last detail to hit hard and fast without giving enemy time to respond. 2 days later, the 3 Dreadnoughts departed Arcturus Station, each heading toward different target in coordinated assault codenamed Operation Liberation that would be largest offensive in human military history, and the Titan moved toward industrial colony New Moscow, where Krell had established their largest occupation force with 35 warships, including several newest heavy cruisers. Goliath headed for research colony New Cambridge, where Krell forced human scientists to work on military projects, and Harper mission was complicated by need to prevent enemy from destroying research facilities containing decades of valuable work, and Leviathan made for orbital colony New Alexandria, which Krell had converted into military fortress, and Brennan would need to assault hardened defensive position while protecting millions of civilians. Aboard, Rachel stood on Titan Bridge as ship dropped from faster-than-light travel at edge of New Moscow system, and immediately tactical display lit up with enemy contacts, and intelligence had been accurate with 35 Krell warships in orbit already moving to intercept in dispersed formation, staying spread out to minimize railgun effectiveness. Rachel studied enemy formation with approval, noting they were learning and respecting human capabilities now, but spread formation or not, they could not escape human weapons range, and she ordered the Titan into position for broadside attack with all weapon systems at maximum power to show Krell that adapting was not enough, but Rachel had anticipated Krell tactical adjustments and spent past 2 days running simulations developing new tactics of her own because the Krell were not the only ones who could adapt, and she ordered her weapons officer to forget railguns and power up the Graviton Lance to target center of enemy formation and show them how new weapons handled their adjusted tactics. The Graviton Lance activated, and reality itself seemed to ripple as the weapon used quantum-controlled graviton emitters to create focused beam of intense gravitational force invisible to conventional sensors and undetectable until impact and absolutely devastating in effect, as the first Krell cruiser caught in beam simply came apart when intense gravitational gradient pulled molecules in different directions in less than a second. A 200-meter warship was reduced to component atoms spreading an expanding cloud, and 3 more ships caught on beam edges had hulls buckle and twist as gravitational forces tore at them, and internal bulkheads collapsed and systems failed catastrophically, and within 10 seconds all were spinning. Wrecks with crews dead or dying remaining. Krell halted their advance, and formation broke as panic spread because they witnessed something impossible that defied their understanding of physics and warfare, and Rachel smiled coldly and ordered railguns to fire at will, and tungsten rounds found targets with unerring accuracy, and ship after ship died under relentless barrage within 20 minutes. The battle was over, and Krell occupation fleet was destroyed, and New Moscow was free, and humanity demonstrated yet another weapon that rendered Krell military doctrine obsolete, and similar results occurred at other targets where Harper Goliath destroyed New Cambridge forces while precision strikes disabled research facilities without harm, and Brennan Leviathan methodically dismantled New Alexandria defenses, freeing civilian population in single coordinated strike. Humanity liberated all occupied colonies, and Krell invasion was over, and occupation forces were destroyed or captured, and message to galaxy was clear that humanity would not be conquered and would not surrender, and those who threatened human worlds would face consequences beyond their comprehension. But war was far from over because Krell Empire still existed and commanded vast fleets and controlled dozens of conquered worlds and still possessed industrial capacity to continue fighting for years if necessary, and question now was what humanity would do next, and would they stop at liberation satisfied with driving Krell from human space, or take war to the enemy on Earth? In command center beneath Geneva, Crawford studied strategic situation with senior staff, and decision before them would shape future of humanity place in galaxy, and Admiral already knew what he would recommend to civilian leadership, which was to take fight to Krell and show them and everyone else watching that humanity was not just defending itself but sending message. He said quietly they would take war to Krell home and show the Empire and galaxy that attacking humanity meant bringing war to your doorstep, and General Santos nodded, saying Dreadnoughts proved themselves in combat, and now they should see how they performed in enemy territory, and Crawford activated communicator. The journey into Krell space represented a turning point in human history, because for the first time, humanity was not simply defending territory or responding to aggression, but launching preemptive campaign into enemy-controlled space, carrying war to an alien empire that had never experienced defeat on its own territory. The 3 Earth dreadnoughts, now battle-tested and proven, departed Arcturus Station with clear mission to strike at heart of Krell military infrastructure and demonstrate that humanity could project power anywhere in sector, and it was mission fraught with risk, but offered tremendous strategic advantages if successful. Joining dreadnoughts were 6 heavy cruisers and 12 destroyers and numerous support vessels, making it largest human fleet ever assembled, and destination was Krell military shipyard at Corveth Prime, deep in enemy territory, where intelligence suggested production of 50 warships simultaneously at full capacity, churning out vessels to replace losses suffered in human space. Rachel stood in Titan war room studying holographic projections of their target, noting this would not be like previous engagements because they were attacking hardened target with significant defensive installations, and Krell would have time to prepare and would know they were coming. Commander Patterson nodded, saying shipyard was protected by orbital defense platforms and minefields and permanent garrison of at least 40 warships, and Krell had 2 months to study human tactics and develop countermeasures, so this would not be easy. But Weapons Officer Walsh observed that easy does not win wars, and destroying this shipyard would cripple Krell ship production in entire sector. Rachel, asked about Approach Vector and Navigation Officer Chen, manipulated display showing they would drop from faster than light at edge of Corveth system, and from there, 6-hour transit to shipyard at maximum conventional speed, and Krell would detect them the moment they arrived with no element of surprise. Rachel replied they would not rely on surprise but on firepower and coordination. In fact, they had never lost a battle, and Krell knew that and were afraid, and humanity would use that fear. And communication alert chimed, showing Captain Harper on Goliath reporting all ships ready for jump on her signal. Rachel took deep breath knowing this was point of no return, because once they entered Krell space they would be committed to attack, with no retreat and no second chances, and they would either destroy shipyard and return victorious or die trying. And she broadcast to fleet, saying they would enter enemy territory and strike at heart of Krell power and prove them wrong about their invincibility. The fleet vanished in cascade of exotic particles as faster-than-light drives activated, carrying them across vast distances between stars and on Corveth Prime. Supreme Commander Vorkash stood in Central Command Center overseeing production operations at massive orbital complex stretching hundreds of kilometers, where thousands of Krell worked around clock producing warships. Their empire needed in 2 months since human liberation of occupied colonies. Vorkash worked tirelessly to prepare for counterattack, developing new shield generators and improved weapons and better sensors all deployed throughout Krell military. But he harbored no illusions about challenge they faced because humans demonstrated technological capabilities, rivaling or exceeding Krell achievements, and their tactical flexibility was impressive. Sensor officer voice carried urgent alarm, announcing multiple faster-than-light signatures at edge of system matching human vessels, with 3 large contacts, and multiple smaller escorts, and it was them. And the Dreadnoughts and Vorkash felt his hearts accelerate knowing this moment would come. But reality of facing human fleet on his own territory sent cold chill through his scaled body. He commanded general alert and deployment of defense fleet and activation of orbital platforms and arming of minefield, saying if humans wanted battle, they would get one, they would never forget. And throughout massive shipyard complex alarms blared and personnel rushed to stations and garrison fleet of 42 warships powered up engines and weapons, orbital defense platforms, each one a fortress targeted heavy guns toward approaching enemy, and minefield-activated guidance systems, and Krell were ready, or at least thought they were. But human fleet emerged from faster-than-light in perfect formation with 3 dreadnoughts at center, and escorts arrayed like protective shell. Rachel studied tactical display, noting Krell dug in deep with platforms, covering entire approach vector and minefield, creating no-go zone around shipyard and fleet position to engage before humans could close to effective range, and Weapons Officer Walsh observed. This was standard defensive doctrine, which meant they should not use standard attack. Commander Patterson smiled, saying quantum tunneling torpedo system was fully operational and ready for deployment, and engineering loaded all tubes. And Rachel nodded, because these torpedoes were another product of Earth crash weapons development using quantum mechanics principles to briefly phase out of normal space, allowing them to pass through shields and armor and solid matter before detonating inside targets. They had never been tested in combat, but simulations suggested devastating effectiveness against hardened targets like orbital platforms, and Rachel ordered launch sequence targeting platforms first, because once neutralized they could deal with fleet and minefield and the Titan along. With Goliath and Leviathan launched quantum torpedoes that accelerated rapidly and activated phase systems and vanished from conventional sensors. On Corveth Prime, Defense Coordinator watched in confusion as human missiles disappeared from displays, asking what happened and where they went. But before anyone answered, orbital platforms began exploding as quantum torpedoes reappeared inside platform hulls and detonated with antimatter warheads, releasing tremendous energy directly into internal structures, and in 30 seconds 12 platforms were completely destroyed. Vorkash stared at tactical display in shock, saying impossible, because they penetrated shields without triggering them, but there was no time to analyze impossible as human. Dreadnoughts advanced and without platforms to support them. Krell garrison fleet was exposed and vulnerable, and he commanded fleet deployment using new adaptive shields designed specifically to counter human kinetic weapons. Krell fleet charged forward with adaptive shields flickering, using rapidly shifting energy frequencies to deflect or absorb railgun rounds. And it was impressive achievement of Krell engineering. But it also did not matter because Dreadnoughts did not bother with railguns this time, and instead used plasma cannons and graviton lance in combination, creating devastating barrage that adaptive shields could not possibly handle. Krell ships died by dozens with new defensive systems overwhelmed by weapons they had no counter for, and Rachel watched battle unfold with grim satisfaction, observing that Krell were learning but always one step behind. And by time they developed counters to current weapons, humanity would have deployed new ones. Weapons officer reported garrison fleet breaking with 20 ships destroyed and rest attempting retreat toward shipyard, and Rachel ordered not letting them reach it, and all ships increase speed to isolate shipyard and make it vulnerable, while Captains Harper and Brennan split attack vectors to hit from 3 sides simultaneously. The 3 dreadnoughts split up, each taking different approach to massive shipyard, and remaining Krell warships tried forming defensive screen, but were too few and too demoralized to mount effective resistance, and human escorts systematically eliminated defenders, while dreadnoughts focused on primary objective. Rachel studied shipyard on view screen, noting impressive structure as testament to Krell industrial capacity, with dozens of ships in construction bays and thousands of workers unaware of what was about to happen, and she activated fleet-wide channel warning all Krell personnel they had 10 minutes to evacuate before facility would be destroyed. Patterson looked questioningly, saying Krell might use those 10 minutes to try something, but Rachel replied they would deal with it. But she would not kill thousands of workers who had no choice in this war, because Krell leadership made decision to invade human space, and those workers were just trying to survive, and humanity was better than Krell by showing mercy when possible. On Corveth Prime, Vorkash listened to human captain message with mixture of respect and frustration, knowing humans could destroy shipyard immediately, but instead gave his people time to evacuate, which was simultaneously tactically foolish and morally admirable, and he made decision quickly, ordering all non-combat personnel to evacuate immediately, using available transport throughout. Complex Krell rushed toward escape pods and transport ships, and within 8 minutes shipyard was empty, and Rachel watched evacuation counting down final seconds, and when timer reached 0 she gave order. She knew was necessary, but took no pleasure in commanding all dreadnoughts to fire and destroy shipyard. Combined firepower of 3 Earth dreadnoughts focused on single target was sight few would witness as railguns and plasma cannons and graviton lances unleashed fury simultaneously, and Corveth Prime shipyard that stood for century and produced thousands of warships disintegrated under onslaught, with explosions rippling through structure as construction materials and fuel stores and incomplete warships reduced to debris. Rachel stood at observation window watching destruction with mixed emotions, knowing this was major victory and crippling blow to Krell production, but also reminder of terrible cost of war. The destruction of Corveth Prime sent shockwaves throughout Krell Empire, because for first time in 2 centuries, they suffered major defeat on their own territory, and psychological impact was immense as conquered species whispered of rebellion. And Krell military officers questioned leadership wisdom, and High Council faced crisis of confidence, unlike anything in their history. But war was not over, because Krell Empire still commanded hundreds of warships and controlled vast territories, and possessed industrial capacity to continue fighting for years if necessary. And question was whether they would choose that path, or whether message humanity sent would finally penetrate their warrior pride. On Earth, Fleet Admiral Crawford stood before joint session of planetary government, presenting assessment of strategic situation in massive chamber, filled with representatives from every nation and population center, all waiting to hear what Admiral recommended for next phase of war. Crawford began saying they achieved all immediate military objectives with occupied colonies liberated, and Krell military production crippled, and demonstrated Earth could project power deep into enemy territory, and by any measure campaign had been complete. Success, but now faced critical decision whether to continue offensive operations or consolidate gains, and offer opportunity to negotiate peace. Settlement. President Maria Santiago asked for professional recommendation, and Crawford chose words carefully. saying his recommendation was pursuing negotiated peace from position of overwhelming strength, making clear they could continue striking Krell targets, but also offering way to end war with dignity reasonably intact, because alternative was prolonged conflict costing countless lives and potentially destabilizing entire sector. Ambassador Liu asked what if Krell refused to negotiate and chose continuing fight, and Crawford replied grimly, they would have no choice but to continue military operations. But he believed, based on Vorkash words to Rachel, that elements within Krell leadership understood situation, because they never faced enemy like humanity, and were afraid, and fear could be powerful motivator for peace. General Santos added perspective, saying Dreadnoughts proved themselves beyond optimistic projections but were not invincible. And humanity had been fortunate Krell had not developed effective countermeasures yet, and giving them too much time could change that. So strike now with diplomatic overtures while holding every advantage chamber, fell into discussion with representatives debating wisdom of seeking peace versus continuing military pressure, and some argued for pushing advantage and destroying more installations to force complete capitulation, while others emphasized moral imperative of seeking peace after such devastating victories. President Santiago called for order, saying decision was too important to rush and they would take formal vote tomorrow, and Crawford should prepare both military contingency plan for continued operations and diplomatic framework for peace negotiations to be ready for either outcome. While Earth debated, Krell High Council faced its own reckoning as 7 members gathered in Obsidian Chamber with weight of first major military defeat hanging over them, and Supreme Commander Vorkash stood before them, reporting destruction of Corveth Prime, painting grim picture of human technological capabilities exceeding Krell own in critical areas. Council member Therix slammed fist, demanding they develop new tactics and weapons because they were Krell Empire and did not surrender to inferior species. But Science Director Melkara voice was sharp, asking if humans were inferior when they defeated Krell at every turn and destroyed fleets and liberated colonies and struck important installations while showing capacity for mercy and strategic thinking never encountered before. She activated display, showing human operations, noting they could have killed every Krell at Corveth, but gave time to evacuate and could have pursued retreating fleets but returned to own space. And these humans were not mindless aggressors, but sending message to end war or face continued escalation. Council member Drakon spoke thoughtfully, saying, Science Director raised valid points, but they must consider political implications, because negotiating with humans showed weakness to every conquered species, and rebellions could spread throughout Empire. Vorkash interjected that rebellions were already spreading because word of defeats reached subject worlds, and some refused tribute while others organized resistance, and if they continued war and lost again, Empire could collapse entirely. But if they negotiated from position of strength, acknowledging humans as worthy opponents rather than defeated enemies, they might preserve authority. Chamber fell silent as council members contemplated this, because for centuries, Krell maintained Empire through fear and overwhelming force. But what happened when force was no longer overwhelming and when enemy not only matched but exceeded their military capabilities? Finally, eldest council member War Leader Cormac spoke with ancient voice still strong, saying, humans taught them something valuable about limits to conquest, and that technology and determination could overcome numerical superiority, and mercy could be weapon as powerful as any gun. And they invaded human space seeking to add them to Empire, but instead humans became first species in 2 centuries to defeat them in open combat. He proposed sending emissary to Earth not to surrender, but negotiate as equals, acknowledging human strength and offering peace with honor in exchange for ceasing military operations and allowing Krell to maintain other territories where both sides saved face and avoided further bloodshed, and perhaps in time might find common ground for cooperation against threats menacing all civilized species. Proposal hung in air because it was unprecedented, and Krell never negotiated as equals with any species, only ever dictating terms or fighting to death, and this would be fundamental change in how Empire operated. But as each council member considered alternatives, the wisdom of Cormac's suggestion became clear, because pride brought them here and pragmatism could lead away from disaster. One by one council members indicated agreement, and even Therix Most militant among them eventually nodded reluctantly, and Vorkash said he would lead diplomatic mission personally, because if negotiating with humans, they should send someone who witnessed capabilities firsthand to give words more credibility. 2 weeks later, unusual sight appeared at edge of Sol system, as single Krell diplomatic vessel escorted by 2 human destroyers made way toward Earth, and aboard ship Vorkash, prepared for most important negotiation of his career, having spent journey studying human culture and history, trying to understand species that so thoroughly defeated his empire. What he discovered both impressed and troubled him because humanity history was filled with conflict, but also remarkable examples of reconciliation and cooperation, where they waged terrible wars among themselves only to become allies afterward and valued both strength and compassion. Seeing no contradiction between the two, ship landed at Geneva Spaceport, where formal reception was arranged, and as Vorkash descended ramp, he saw a delegation of human leaders waiting with Crawford at center, flanked by President Santiago and General Santos, and several officials, and behind them, standing at attention in full dress uniform, were 3 Dreadnought captains, Rachel Morrison and Kevin Harper, and Nicole Brennan. The warriors who defeated his fleet's Crawford stepped forward, welcoming Vorkash to Earth and hoping journey was comfortable, and Vorkash inclined head respectfully, thanking them for agreeing to meeting and saying he came bearing message from Krell High Council, wishing to negotiate end to hostilities between their peoples. Crawford replied they were prepared to listen, but any agreement must include complete withdrawal of Krell forces from human space and release of all prisoners and binding guarantees against future aggression. And Vorkash replied these terms were acceptable to High Council, seeking only to end conflict and establish peaceful coexistence, because Empire learned hard lesson believing themselves invincible until humans showed otherwise. Negotiations lasted 3 days as human and Krell diplomats worked through every detail of what would become Geneva Accords, with comprehensive agreement where all Krell forces would withdraw within 6 months and all prisoners released immediately, and both sides established neutral zone and permit trade and cultural exchange, carefully monitored, and most importantly agree to mutual defense pact against external threats to either species. It was imperfect agreement, with many on both sides objecting to various provisions where some humans wanted war crimes, trials, and some Krell wanted military bases in neutral zone. But pragmatism and desire for peace overcame objections. On final day, as formal treaty was signed in ceremony broadcast across both human and Krell space, Crawford made statement that would be remembered for generations, saying today marked end of short but devastating war that was forced upon humanity, and they responded with everything they had and emerged victorious, but victory without wisdom was hollow. He said they could continue war and push for complete defeat of Krell Empire, but at what cost in lives and destruction, and humanity proved it could fight, and now they proved they could make peace, showing galaxy that Earth sought not domination but coexistence, and their strength served not conquest but protection. And when making peace, they did so with same determination shown in war. 6 months later, Rachel stood on Titan observation deck watching last Krell transport depart New Perth, and colony had been rebuilt with population restored and